You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice Radio, Episode 4. I'm your host, David Gornoski. Today, I talk about what violence is. I explore what real violence is versus fictitious violence, and I explain how it works in society and how we make law. A Neighbor's Choice deals with the issue of violence a lot. And so I thought it would be important for me at the ground level to explain what I mean by violence. That word is used a lot in politics, theology, ethics, philosophy, critical theory. There's a whole host of different discussions about violence taking place in academia, in the media, and all kinds of different groups. And so this program and the A Neighbor's Choice project deals with violence. And so we need to have some ground rules as we go forward. So I'm not going to be too dogmatic about this. I'm going to give a common sense definition of violence. And the way I'll do it is by first imagining a society with no rules. No rules. No laws. Think about it. No laws. That's chaos. A society without rules, meaning you can do whatever you want. There's no consequences. There's no defensive structure in place to prevent anything from happening, period. That would be anarchy. And so if we had no rules, that means that things like theft, fraud, assault, burglary, robbery, murder, rape, genocide, torture, all of those things which are physically violent would have absolutely no consequence. You could steal at your heart's desire. You could go into anybody's house and take their Xbox if you wanted. You could write up a phony contract selling beachfront property in Idaho to a blind senior citizen and have absolutely zero consequence. You could murder. You could steal. You could create elaborate Ponzi schemes to rip people off of their savings, their investments. You could torture people. And no one would have any social recognized authority to stop any of that. Would we want to live in that kind of society? Absolutely not. And as someone who is trying to introduce the imitation of Jesus as a social ordering principle, which it is, I think it's important to distinguish that there are certain rules that every civilized society should be governed by. Now, we can get into the question of how would be the most preferable way of setting up such a governance. What would be the most effective system for governance? And that's for discussion for another time. But we all have to come to the table and realize that there are certain indisputable rules of conduct that an ethical and just and sane society should have ruling its operations. And so what I've just listed, theft, coercion, fraud, assault, threats of assault, torture, rape, murder, all of those disgusting things we all recognize are things that we should not allow to be done without consequence. This should not have to be even discussed, but actually you'd be surprised, given some of the things that our societies allow in another context in which we'll get into in just a few minutes. So that's the ground rules starting this discussion. And I think they're completely consistent with the imitation of Jesus' social ordering principles. Jesus was very concerned with the way we victimize people, the way we treat our neighbor. And one of the foundational principles behind that is the idea that you cannot sell poison to a child who can't make a consenting decision for themselves. You cannot sell them a loaded gun to a toddler, okay? That would be a violent, coercive act. You're taking advantage of a child who doesn't have the consenting mental faculties to make such a decision of ownership or purchase. And the same goes for other basic common sense understanding of what's right and wrong that we should all share. You can't kill someone. You can't take their car. You can't take their business. You can't take their body. You cannot enslave someone. You do not have any legitimate right to go to your neighbor and find that they need to share more of the fruits of their labor because they're a doctor and you are something else that's not making as much money as a doctor, and tell that doctor that he will use his skills for your benefit, even if it's a serious health issue, or else he will receive violence or even deadly force if he still refuses after violence. You can't do that. Everyone knows this. This is a deeply universal concept of empathy, that you don't treat others the way you don't want to be treated yourself. No one wants to be, at least consciously wants to be forced into doing something against their will. That is the fundamental kind of lesson we learn in childhood, that people say mean things to us as children. They can bully us, they can mock us, tease us, but we don't have the right to punch someone or threaten them physically in order to get them to change their thoughts or their speech patterns, or if they have a better lunch box than you do. We understand at a very young age, if you have a terrible lunch box and they have a very nice lunch box, you can't steal it. There's no legitimacy for this. And so that is something we all understand on a personal level. The problem comes into when we talk about society, when we talk about how we're going to order our neighborhoods, when we talk about how we're going to order our communities. How are we going to get along when there's lots of us? And then suddenly everything gets wishy-washy. Suddenly things that we just established a few minutes ago become surprisingly fuzzy for some reason for many of us. And this is where the rub comes in. You see, I contend that law in society, however we function, however we want to order our government systems, is really irrelevant to me, except for one asterisk, and that is this. The only legitimate law is that which would use defensive force to restrict a behavior that you yourself as an individual would be morally within your right to restrict as an individual. So let me restate that. The only legitimate law in society is that which is a natural extension of an act of defensive force you yourself could take to stop a certain behavior. And so, as we established earlier, fraud, theft, assault, murder, physical violence of any kind, physical theft, or, like I said, fraudulent contract. Those are issues that if we saw them taking place in our normal personal lives and there was no other standard or structure in place to stop said behavior, and we were the only ones ourselves to take care of it, we would be in a legitimate moral standing to use force to say, no, excuse me, I'm not going to allow you to make a contract to a blind handicapped lady selling her prime beachfront property in the tundra of Russia. Okay? Not going to happen. No, not doing that. And if in using force to physically restrain said person, if he continues making such contracts of that nature, of fraudulent nature. So you can extend from that individual common sense understanding, that we would be within our rights if someone was being burglarized and an elderly lady was having her purse stolen from her. You would be within your ethical right, no matter how hungry that thief was, no matter how grumpy that old lady could be. You are within your ethical right to restrain the attacker, grab the purse forcibly, and make sure that the lady is in a safe place and that the attacker is not able to do it again if it appears that this is the kind of behavior he has a pattern of engaging in. You would be within your ethical or moral right as an individual to use force to restrain that behavior, and therefore you could extend that innate right, that innate morality that you yourself have. You can then naturally, of course, extend that to other groups of people to do the same thing for you on a societal level, which means you can have a law that everybody agrees that, no, we don't allow theft. We don't allow, it doesn't matter. It does not matter if the person was delusional. It doesn't matter if there was some kind of a mental disorder of the person stealing the purse. It doesn't matter if they were really, really hungry. We don't, as a rule, we don't allow that kind of behavior to happen without some kind of defensive shield in place to protect victims from being exploited in that way. It's pretty common sense, right? Well, a lot of people will tell you that what I've just described is very, very radical. Wow, can you believe it? They would say that I'm talking about an ideological construct here. I don't think I am, and I think you understand that too. We're talking about common sense. This is a universal ethical framework that everybody understands. Problem is, it gets fuzzy when we talk about politics, and that's where people get a little strange on. I mean, there's no reason to, because I've just established the only permissible law is that which you have an ethical, moral right to do yourself. Now, I'm not talking about whether would be wise to do it yourself. For example, you yourself could be very ill or frail or elderly, and you see a pack of people beating up someone. You shouldn't intervene. You're not probably going to make the situation any better. So it may not be wise for everybody to do that. But in the core principle of it, the core ethical principle, which is what Jesus is all about, universal ethical principles of making an abundant life and making the kingdom of heaven's will done on earth as it is in heaven, is that we defend victims from acts of coercion, fraud, abuse, oppression, and that there is a legitimate place for the defensive use of force. Force is not the same thing as violence. Let me be clear on that. If you pull somebody off of an older lady who's having her purse stolen, you restraining that person is not inherently violent. Violent is illegitimate use of coercion or force against someone who's done nothing violent. So when you're restraining someone, it can turn violent in a technical sense of if you're punching them and kicking them and you're going beyond the level necessary to restrain that attacker, then it becomes maybe in the realm of violence, when you're adding insult to the situation as opposed to merely being a shield of protection. That's when it can get into the area of vengeance. But the principle in and of itself of physically grabbing, so to speak, someone putting them in a full Nelson or some kind of a lock to hold them until the situation, other people can come and put this person in a place where they can't keep stealing and hurting people or assaulting people, that is legitimate. Okay, it's not violent. It's force. Force is a natural extension of human empathy in the defense of victims. But it has to be clear that it's not some kind of imagined assault against a victim, but actually a real assault taking place, an actual fraudulent contract, an actual theft taking place. The actual assault or threat thereof of assault or murder or rape. Those are situations in which defense and the defensive force is appropriate. Again, what I'm saying here is very common sense, in my opinion. It's not this is not very radical stuff. But when you get in with ideological people, they want to turn this into something very radical. And it's okay, because we're all blinded by modern ideology. All of us, including myself. We all have blind spots on. Because when we get into massive group identities, we start believing in fictional abilities that we naturally know are inappropriate to do ourselves. So the crowd has a way of possessing us and making us legitimize things that we would normally know. If we did them ourselves as individuals, we would be sickened by it, how disgusting that is. And so I believe that the only legitimate law is that which uses force to restrain violence itself. And that is fraud, theft, coercion, assault, murder, rape. Those are actual violent acts. And so therefore, you have an ethical right to restrain that behavior yourself. And therefore, you have an ethical right to extend that ethical right to the broader society. What you don't have a right is to make up something that the society can do on your behalf if you hire people to do it for you, that you yourself would be immoral to do yourself. So what that means is if you use any violence against a nonviolent act, for example, let's say you see your neighbor using a drug. Let's say you see your neighbor being greedy with his wages that he pays his employees. Let's say you see your neighbor offering a sex act to another consenting adult, and both parties are consenting in this choice. All of these acts I've just described are non-violent acts. We can call them vices, sins, we can call them disgusting, we can use whatever words we want to use, but there is no violence taking place, and therefore there is no legitimate right to use violence to stop this behavior. This is something that we'll have to solve as civilized adults using other means to persuade, to pressure, to delegitimize, and even to some extent to shame behaviors that we don't find beautiful, that we find to be destructive for people's personal well-being. But we cannot take a shortcut to the heaven of people not using their bodies for sex work, or the heaven of people not needing to use recreational drugs in an abusive manner, or the heaven of every employee or employer being very equitable and sharing in their wealth. Those are all heavenly aspirations, but we can't take a shortcut to heaven that leads to hell. We can't use violence to force a heavenly ideal, because once we do that, we lead our culture into hell, and that is a place in which violence escalates in a very rapid fashion. And so that is something I just want to lay down as a foundational point, that we need law. I love law. I love real law. I am the biggest supporter of law and order, in the sense that true law is the defensive force necessary to prevent people from being able to steal with leisure, with pleasure, with no consequence, being able to assault or murder or rape with absolutely no fear of any consequence or timeout from society. I believe in real law, and that's what that is. I do not believe in illegitimate law that sees nonviolent behaviors that we ourselves would never do ourselves. We would never barge into our neighbor's house with a no-knock raid ourselves, with guns to the hilt, and bust down the door and draw arms and scream and yell at our neighbor and tell them to get on the ground. And if they don't get on the ground fast enough, throw them to the ground and put our knee on the back of their neck and wrestle with them, tase them if they struggle or mouth off, or if they run away or what have you and you feel threatened, shoot them. We would never find any of that at all permissible for us to do as individuals. In fact, we'd just be disgusted by that. But when we create this fictional concept that we can do things as a group that we're not allowed to do as individuals, such as a group get together and hire politicians that create laws that criminalize a nonviolent act like drug use or drug selling, and then send armed agents to use deadly force if necessary on our behalf. Somehow we think that we can obfuscate our responsibility for the violence in that scenario, and you simply can't. You simply cannot. And that's where we get into the issue of the fact that the state is a religion. It's a myth that we are deluding ourselves into. This has happened for thousands and thousands of years. This is something that we've had to deal with. Humans are innately religious in the way we create societies. The word religion means to bind together. So anytime we have a common purpose or a common value or a common aim or goal that we feel that we're bound together as a community around, we are talking about religion and culture, the same thing. And that's where we then extend what our law structure will look like. And so let me be very clear here again. The only legitimate use of force is defensive, a shield to protect victims and vulnerable people from having their possessions stolen from them, coerced, defrauded, assaulted, raped, murdered. Those are the situations which we all understand we can use defense of force to restrain any of these acts. Anything else is illegitimate law. Anything else which uses violence is a illegitimate use of the law, which means it's no law at all. It's chaos as law. It's chaos enshrined as law. To criminalize a bad behavior that enough people, usually we say it's a majority of the people, but it's not always that, elect people to create laws to that effect. We cannot put people in a cage if they sell milk from a cow that hasn't been pasteurized and homogenized. And yet there's a law that says we do put people in cages if they sell raw milk. Why? Because the fiction, the myth of the state religion kicks in, and people's brains shut down after they've been told since they were young that somehow, it's okay because enough people said so. No, it's not okay. That's called a barbaric approach. This idea that, we live in a society and majority, if enough people say it's right, then it means it's okay. Well, that's a totally chaotic and insane form of having ethics. That basically says if enough people say they want something to be so, then it is so, and there's nothing you can do about it. Why? Because majority of the people say so. So what that is just a violent, vulgar, barbaric, pathetic approach to law. That's what democracy, as it really is, it boils down to. We have enough majority on our side, which means we have the force to leverage another minority interest into doing what we say, or else they will have deadly force consequences if they disagree, if they still want to act the way we want them to not act. That is a vulgar, very archaic and outdated way of dealing with people. And it's something that The only reason why it persists is because people are not waking up to the fact that it is a religious myth that we should repent of. Repent simply means to change our mind, to have a complete about-face approach in voting for anybody that continues such illegitimate laws, or if we're called to jury, rendering a guilty verdict against anyone who is being tried on the basis of a law against nonviolent behavior. Again, we are not legitimizing ugly vices, okay? In fact, when you use violence against a nonviolent vice, that is the best way to legitimize the vice, because you create a black market, or you create an underground current of resentment by the people guilty of the nonviolent act, which creates a mirror blowback where violence escalates out of control. So it's the Jesus principle of turning the other cheek as a social ordering principle of dismantling systems of evil and vice and bad behavior by letting the bad behavior fall on its own weight, and being there as a neighbor to empathically, creatively create organizations and structures and, most importantly, patterns of behavior in our own personal lives, which make it contagious to not do those bad behaviors, which makes it contagious to not want to use drugs, or to even be in a social context in which you feel the need to abuse drugs, to opt out of your society. And so that's what we have to focus on. And that's what we do at A Neighbor's Choice. So again, that is the starting point of violence for me. And I'd love to hear your feedback on it and your response. So you can email me at hello@aneighborschoice.com. That's hello@aneighborschoice.com. This is David Gornoski. Till next time, we'll talk again.